Okay, today is July 26th, 1993, and we are continuing our interview with Paul A. Wolkin. When last we met, you were reminiscing about some of the presidents of the Institute, and in particular you were talking about Harrison Tweed. You have some more thoughts about Harrison Tweed?
Oh, he devoted an immense amount of time to the Institute, both to ALI matters and to ALIABA. On the ALI side, he had a strong interest in almost every project, particularly in the Model Penal Code as it moved along with Herb Wexler. And it was usual for him to attend nearly all advisory committee meetings on every project. And he would be in constant communication with Judge Goodrich, the director at that time, about aspects of the work as it was going forward. And his interest showed, I think, in the improving the quality of the enterprise. He also had strong interest in continuing legal education. You may recall, I think I said earlier, that it was when he became president in 1947 that work began in continuing legal education, and he was one of the prime movers in bringing that about. He knew everything that happened in the work on that project. He was constantly calling John Mulder and talking to him about it. And he had a personal knowledge of each of the members of the ALIABA committee. In those days, there were frequent meetings of that committee. I know they met at least twice a year, once at the time of the ALI annual meeting in Washington, and in the winter in Chicago. In those days, I think the ABA had its midwinter meeting in Chicago, and the site was the old Edgewater Beach Hotel, I think, on the lake. Those were some of the coldest visits I ever endured to that area. And but Tweed ran the show of the ALIABA committee. When I became director of ALIABA, I met with him almost weekly, I think, in New York to review what we were doing. And he was interesting. I'd come up to his law firm. I think by that time he retired as an active partner, and one of the penalties of that was a smaller office. But he still had the office still had a good view, and preliminary to every lunch, he'd open a closet, extract a bottle of scotch, and that's the way we started lunch. I remember spending 1 week with him in Chicago at an ABA meeting, and he was there alone, and I spent every evening with him. What was a threesome, Tweed, Wolkin, and a bottle of scotch. And it worked out very well. His interest in continuing legal education was stimulating. He always egged me on to do more. He was always interested in new ideas and new projects. He was kind of, at one point there, very put out with the American Bar Association because of their inclination to leave ALIABA. I think I spoke about that earlier. And he almost treated that as a personal affront to him, and he became disenamored in those days about the ABA. At one time, I don't know if I mentioned this, at one time he had considered running for president of the ABA. This was while I was also president of ALI. But there was one individual who put that idea down real fast, and that was just Learned Hand. I understand he told Mr. Tweed, no way can you do both.
Conflict of interest or just too much work?
Too much. Focus entirely on ALI, and Tweed followed that astute advice. Harris and Tweed also had a great interest not only in CLE as it manifested itself in Aliaba, but in spreading the word nationally. You may recall that one of the primary objectives of Aliaba was to interest local and state organizations emulating what we were doing, in other words, organizing programs and continuing legal education. And one of the ways Tweed thought of encouraging this was to build up a camaraderie among the various CLE administrators as they were being appointed and increasing in number. Originally, I think there were but 4 or 5, and it's happened that at ABA meetings, John Mulder and I would meet with 3 or 4 or 5 administrators, and we would talk very informally about what we were doing. And I went back one time with John. I said, John, you know, we ought to formalize this group and have the administrators form an organization, a professional organization of CLE administrators. Well, John took that idea up, and Felix Stumpf, who was the CLE man in California and who really contributed great many innovative ideas to continuing legal education, particularly in the publishing area, was receptive to the idea when it was put to him by John. And there were a few people then, I'm trying to recall who their names were. There was Felix, I think there was somebody by the name of Eli Jarmel, Richard Milstein. They may have come in at different times, but that was the nucleus around which an organization by the name of, now called Association of Continuing Legal Education Administrators, was organized. And the organization grew from a handful to many, many members that it has now. But the origin of it goes back to what John Mulder and I were talking about as a result when we participated in these informal sessions of a few of us.
So that was a major development in the nationalizing and spreading of the word of CLE, then, having a national organization of that sort.
What CLIA did to its credit was it provided a forum for those who were members to learn of the techniques for advancing CLE. In those days, particular jurisdictions would have special ideas of how to spread the word, how to have better education, how to improve quality, how to have more people attend. And they would come to an ACLIA meeting. ACLIA still meets twice a year at the time of the ABA meeting and at the time of the midwinter meeting and at the time of the ABA annual meeting. And at these sessions, there would be an exchange of ideas, an exchange of plans, and later on, experts in various fields, such as in advertising or promotion or in learning, would come in and speak to the group. And this has been of great value to those who are responsible for conducting continuing legal education.
In those pioneering days, was there any tension in ACLIA or among the CLE administrators between the local organizations and the national organizations?
Well, to some extent, there was. It was a delicate matter. Aliaba started out when there were no state organizations, and to set an example, would conduct programs at the state level, frequently on subject of particular interest to the state, such as partnerships, law of partnerships. And as ACLIA grew, or as the number of state administrators increased, each of them was particularly concerned about the welfare of the organization in his jurisdiction, or her jurisdiction. And there was concern that a national organization running programs in a jurisdiction might siphon off attendance, interest, money, and to the detriment of the local organization. But this was worked out by discussion and example. experience showed that this did not happen, that I think the more CLE was offered in a place, the more interest there was in whoever was offering CLE, and in time it more or less worked out. There were a couple of national conferences that dealt with the specific problem of coordinating activities and avoiding conflicts, and there were sets of guidelines that were developed that CLE administrators, if they signed up for those guidelines, were expected to follow and did follow, and it turned out to be a pretty civilized enterprise all around. That if Organization A was doing a program and Organization B announced it was going to do one, and they would talk about it, and they would avoid any conflict as to time and date and place.
I take it that Harrison Tweed was a great supporter of moving beyond the original grassroots policy and having CLIA become an active sponsor of national programs. Is that right?
Well, I don't know that he consciously promoted that or endorsed it. It's just something that happened, and when it produced substantial revenues, there was little reason to quarrel with it. It helped spread the word and spread the activity.
How did John Mulder feel about that? Reading between the lines of your book, I get the impression that he wasn't altogether comfortable with the new approach.
Well, John, to his credit, really launched CLE around the country with all the getting it. He planted the seed in many jurisdictions that flowered, and he had some concern about CLIA straying from direct support of all the CLE organizations and sort of not giving them the attention that they should have. But he liked the idea too, because it was helped support the enterprise, and the enterprise needed all the support it could get in the late 50s and early 60s.
You mentioned that one thing that he wasn't comfortable with was marketing, the idea of marketing the CLE product.
Well, John may have had some reservations about that, but he looked at CLE in a different way, I think, than those who followed him. When CLE was a different thing, different enterprise would regard it. He looked at it as a small town, small state, small enterprise, replicated in many places, rather than as one large enterprise encompassing many facets.
Now, Harrison Tweed, after he stepped down as president of the ALI in 1961, did continue for some years after that as chair of the Aliaba Committee, I believe. Norris Dow came in as president in 1961, but he also was quite active in CLE, wasn't he?
Yes, well, let me, what Tweed's interest kind of, I should mention this, shifted in the, forgot the date, but President Kennedy had a meeting of lawyers from all around the country to do something about civil rights. Those were the days when there were problems in some parts of these states that were involved the federal government, and Kennedy called a meeting of lawyers from all over the country, which led to the development of the Lawyers Committee. Was the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights, I think, and the chair of that was the original chair, and he may have been the one that promoted the idea, was Bernard Siegel of Philadelphia, active member of the Institute. But Bernie Siegel persuaded President Kennedy that Bernie needed a co-chair, and the co-chair should be Harrison Tweed. And Harrison Tweed sort of was pushed into it, I think, with some reluctance, but after he took the position co-chairing, being co-chaired with co-chair Siegel, he became a great enthusiast, and he really did a tremendous amount of work in that. And I think at that stage, his interest in CLE sort of gave way to this more important cause in his eyes that needed national attention.
Right.
Now, you mentioned Norris Dow coming in. Yes, he became president. Norris's original interest in the Institute was in tax work, and he was responsible for the first tax project the Institute did in the late 40s, early 50s. Right. And he gave the project much of his attention, and when it came to choose a successor, the nominating committee chose him, and he entered the scene, became very active, and as I mentioned earlier, most of the advisory committee meetings were in New York, at the Westbury, near Herb Wexler's home, and Norris became a faithful attender at those programs. He was a supporter of continuing legal education. He worked at it. I don't think he gave it the time and attention that Harrison Tweed did, but maybe by then it didn't need it, except as there was this crisis with the ABA. And Norris worked on that. I remember having the agreement, I think, of 1974 between ABA and ALI was worked out under Norris auspices and under Chesterfield Smith's auspices, then president or president-elect of the ABA. And I remember meeting in Norris Dow's apartment on Fifth Avenue with Chesterfield Smith and Norris, and working out the final details of that agreement that sort of put the enterprise back on track, two tracks, that of ALI and that of ABA. It was an interesting meeting. We had dinner there. Darrell sent out for Chinese, and it was a pleasant evening and with good results. And Norris continued to push the work of the ALI and support it. He was always wanted to get funding to support more work. And one of his ideas was to have an endowment that would pay the compensation of the director and the executive vice president or assistant director at that time. But it didn't quite come off. But I talked to them in those days about having a capital fund campaign. There were efforts to get people to write the Institute into their wills, but the capital fund campaign really never came to fruition until Rob Perkins became president.
Norris Dow, as you mentioned, first, I guess, became active in the Institute through the tax work, and he may have been one of the few people who was simultaneously elected to the Institute and the Council, I believe, in 1947, and was very much instrumental in starting the work on the federal tax project. Did he remain very involved in the tax work later on, too?
Oh, absolutely. I might mention that he had a special connection with the Institute. Norris Dow was married to Learned Hand's daughter, Mary. Right. And so that there was special reasons for the affinity to the Institute, or maybe even to his becoming president. But that's an interesting sidelight.
Right. Well, he stepped down, I think, in 1976 and was succeeded by Judge Cutter for a relatively brief period of about 4 years. Do you have any recollections about
Oh, yeah, one thing stands out particularly about Judge Cutter, I might say, gave the Institute nearly all of his time, except that he had to spare from his work as a judge. But I remember that one of the early meetings, Bennett Bosque, Judge Cutter, and I met in Boston. We had discovered, and I think in connection with preparing the budget, that certain charges that were made at the annex resulted in Aliaba being overcharged. And it was added up to a tidy sum. And this was one of the problems he faced early in the administration. The question was, what do we do about this? You know, I think only 3 people knew about it. When I pointed out to Bennett and Judge Cutter and myself. And Judge Cutter, straight as an arrow, said, well, we can't let that happen, even though it's going to cost the Institute a substantial sum of money. The Institute should reimburse Aliaba for this overcharge, and that's what was done. And I think that incident illustrates the character of the person that imbued everything he did as president of the Institute. He had a wry sense of humor, didn't have the light touch that Harrison Tweed had, or Senator Pepper, or Norris Dow, and he was businesslike, efficient, and straightforward. If you read the proceedings or read the proceedings of the annual dinner, you will get that sense. I might add, Norris Dow had a very light touch. He frequently at council meetings, which were held at the Association of the Bar, would go to the piano. There was a piano in the room there, and he loved to play tunes. He was a good pianist. I might add, he was the son of, I believe, an itinerant minister, and somehow settled in Minnesota, and later was law clerk to the Supreme Court Justice. But he had a song that he sang a ditty about the Queen of Bees that I've asked his son to send me the lyrics of it. You may follow up on that. It's really a very cute little ditty, and he loved to perform that for the council on occasions.
Queen of Bees.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I guess the other president that you did deal with was Rod Perkins, and I don't know if any president was ever more identified with work on a single project, although he was also involved with so many others. But did you ever know one to get so involved with a project as he did with corporate governance?
Well, Tweed was very involved, I think, with the model penal code. Perhaps Wexler would corroborate that, as well as other projects. And Darrell was involved with tax projects, but I think no president did as much work, hard
substantive
work on a project as Rod Perkins did. There were problems in the other projects, political problems, as it were, but I don't think they were of the magnitude that they were in a corporate governance project, and that required extraordinary skill, patience, negotiating, all the skills of a successful corporate lawyer, which Rod Perkins brought to bear with success in the corporate governance project. That, I think, was almost coterminous with his administration as president. Somehow or another, Institute projects have a way of living beyond their projected lifetimes. In fact, several times over their projected lifetimes. And corporate governance was such a project.
Yes, it was originally supposed to last only 3 years, I believe, wasn't it?
Yes, and we set it up on that basis. I remember working on a budget. I suggested that, that if we're going to do it in 3 years, we ought to have more time from the reporters, and we gave them compensation that was several times the normal rate of compensation, on the theory that they would devote time and bring it to fruition within a very short span of time. But that was another unfulfilled prophecy.
Can you think of any other project that in which the climate was so misjudged that we expected it to be easy and it turned out to be much more complicated?
Not to that extent. There were the model penal code had periods of stress. I don't think of the same. You know, there was the death penalty, and it was decided there instead of to have a vote of the members.
Right.
I remember looking it up for Charlie Wright recently, and
there weren't that many people who actually participated in that vote.
Well, there weren't that many members those days, and there was concern about, I think, abortion in that project, and there was concern about consensual acts among adults. So, but they didn't take on the crusading element that we saw in on the part of the opposition in the corporate governance project. In the torts project, there was to Prosser there was some opposition, but that was usually voiced during the discussion at the annual meeting and overwhelmingly defeated. So there was no continuing fight on that. And in the tax project, there was considerable opposition to some of the ideas Jim Kasner was advancing in the federal estate gift tax field. And interestingly, I might say the tax section at the time some members anyway, showed hostility to ideas that Stanley Surrey was advancing in the income tax project, and particularly to Jim Kasner with his proposals. His first draft just was, as I recall, had to be abandoned. But it's interesting to note that the ideas Jim espoused have become embedded in the law, the marital deduction and transfers among spouses. I'm not a tax lawyer, I'm just trying to recall some of them, and treatment of the taxation subchapter J project. The matters that these sections had opposed are now embedded in the tax law. But there was opposition on the council there to some of the ideas that were advanced in the tax project. There was a very ardent supporter of the Institute of Mr. Miller, who I think at one time was commissioner, who thought ideas being proposed were far too radical, and so did some of the tax section. But I think those controversies turned out to be more civilized, I think, than the controversy that erupted in the corporate governance project.
Yeah, I gather Herb Wexler was quite appalled at the organized quality of the opposition to corporate governance. And
oh yes, he would have been appalled to any organized opposition, lobbying, and so was, I think, in a sense, Rod Perkins. And if you read the proceedings, I think he stated what the proper conduct of an ALI member should be, and when he differs with a project, the recommendations of a project, and how it should be dealt with.
Right.
But everything turned out, I guess, as well as could be expected.
And the Institute has never been really a stranger to controversy, and wouldn't expect to be, I guess.
No.
I imagine that will continue. Well, you've talked about Jim Kasner a little bit, and was he one of perhaps the most memorable of the reporters that you've worked with? I suppose you.
Oh, I think most of the reporters were memorable. I think Stanley Surrey was superb as a reporter, and as originally he was a reporter, I think, on the federal income tax project. Later on, he sort of was a flashpoint for people in the section. Some of the ideas that he had when he was in government, in Treasury, roused considerable opposition. And after the federal income tax project was completed, sort of doing work and taxation was dormant. And I had a number of conversations with Stanley, and I think he and I conspired, in a sense, to have the Institute go back to tax projects. And gentle persuasion I used on Herb Wexler, I think, won him over. And the Institute then embarked on other tax projects. Stanley sort of was the coordinator or the overseer. He was not the active reporter, although he would be sitting at this table with the reporters. Anderson came in, and
this was in contrast to the original project when he was the reporter,
yeah,
I guess,
yeah,
back in the 40s.
Yeah, and then even on Kasner, when Kasner started, while Stanley was alive, he was sort of a omnipresent on the project. He worked well with all the reporters, and we had subchapter K, subchapter J, the
international
aspects, accessions tax study by Bill Andrews. I said Anderson, should be Bill Andrews. And but Jim, he had a remarkable career as a reporter. It started almost at the beginning of the Institute and lasted in one way or another throughout his lifetime. He may have been a reporter on more projects than any other individual. He had his way of challenging the audience to respond to his outrageous statements and then working things around so it came out, everything came out the way it should. Seavey and Scott were great reporters. Seavey did agency, and with Scott did restitution, and Scott, of course, did trusts, and they were almost unchallenged as reporters. Willis Reese had real difficulty. He was the reporter on the conflict of laws, and early in the days, he aroused the antagonism for some reason of a number of council members. Willis had some remarkably new ideas and concepts that he incorporated in restatement, the conflict of laws, which the field was generating all sorts of new thoughts, getting away from the Bealesian view of conflicts. But Willis had a very loud voice that he couldn't really modulate. And Willis had another problem, that when there was disagreement, he would agree with everybody. and this was difficult, and he particularly got Learned Hand upset about, Judge Hand about that. And it reached a point where there was a special meeting of the executive committee that was called really to see what they're going to do about the reportership for conflict of laws. Well, I did some lobbying with some people, and I didn't want anything to happen to Willis. And the solution was to appoint as reporter with them, I forgot what his exact title was, Professor Scott. And after that, the project went on and to conclusion after a long period of time. As you may recall, there was even difficulty with conflicts later on in
the revisions in the late 80s.
Not the revisions so much. Very recently in
the complex litigation project.
Yeah, they're very difficult questions.
Some of the scholars, some of the members of the Institute complained that the proposals for the complex litigation project were going back to more specific rules and retreating back to the first restatement rather than the greater flexibility of the second. So.
Excuse me.
No, I guess it's a continuing battle over conflicts.
Contracts was a long, enduring project, but Alan Farnsworth did a superb job on that.
He replaced Browker when Browker became judge. I
Well,
guess.
yeah, Browker, of course, was first rate as a reporter, and that project. Well, both Browker and Farnsworth really contributed a great deal to the ultimate success of that project.
What about Prosser on the second restatement of torts?
Well, Prosser was a freight train, or not a freight train, an express train that you couldn't stop. He had ideas, and he had very supportive advisors, Wex Malone, and to name one of them, and the Keatons, and Justice Traynor, and he came in with what was it, 420 or
402A.
402A, and I think at that point the objection was raised that there were only you could only cite 2 or 3 jurisdictions for the proposition, but he was confident. He made the statement that in time everybody would adopt the 402A, and
Yes, he was right.
his forecast was correct. So he was, well, the Institute had many great reporters. Each had their own style. Now, take judgments, for example. Restatement of judgments, originally, I think, was done by Scott and Seavey, who also did jointly, if I remember correctly, restatement of restitution.
Yes.
And then when it came to do a new restatement of judgments, they selected Professors Kaplan, Ben Kaplan. I don't know if he was a professor then or already on the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts. And the Shapiro. And they were well on their way when I think Shapiro was taken ill, and matters came to a point where they had to have a new reporter, and who they selected? Somebody named Professor Hazard, who did a tremendous job on that restatement, and I think so impressed everyone with his work that was the reason for his ultimate selection as director to succeed, among other reasons, but that especially to succeed Professor Herb Wexler.
Just as Wexler had become director after having done such a good job with the Model Penal Code as reporter.
Right.
You mentioned earlier that people like Scott and Seavey were virtually unchallenged. Was it? I sort of I get the impression that the second restatement of trusts, for example, did not vary all that much from the first restatement, and because of Scott's authority, it was more of an updating job than a real revision the way we're used to now. Is that right?
I think that's right, and probably true. It may have been true of agency also, which Seavey did and Scott did trust. A conflict of law second restatement was a complete changeover, departure in theory and rules. Contracts became a different kind of restatement in the hands of Browker and Farnsworth, and at that time there was a great influence of the Uniform Commercial Code. They interacted between the two of them.
You get the impression that, as a matter of fact, that the earlier second restatements were essentially regarded as revisions. They followed the same section numbers and the same order and so forth, whereas the later ones seem to be more complete rethinking. And in torts, you had 402A. They threw in instead of renumbering things, they just to follow the usual pattern, they just put in a 402A. And contracts was following the original order, I think, for a while, and then halfway through it, they suddenly decided to reorder the whole thing, and subsequent projects have been much more complete revisions.
Well, as time went on, the work rules for Institute efforts became less rigid. One of the differences was between the first restatement and the second restatement, where second restatement had notes, reporters' notes, cited authorities, didn't speak, as Goodrich used to say, so much ex cathedra. And I guess as the go into the third restatement, there's still more flexibility. I should mention another reporter that made a lasting impression was Butch Fisher on the International Foreign Relations Law restatement. That subject evoked controversy on some of the particular sections.
Yes,
So
it certainly did. I can remember the controversy with the second one in particular, the famous incident where the project was delayed for a year so that there was a chance for more comments at the urgings of the State Department and other government agencies.
it seems as the work of the Institute gains more and more influence nationally, it also brings in more interest and therefore more controversy, because there's a wider audience with more diverse interests to respond to what's being put forward.
One other reporter I wanted to ask you about, maybe the only reporter I can think of who subsequently became not director but president of the Institute, Charles Allen Wright. He was, of course, a reporter for the Division of Jurisdiction project.
Yeah, he and
Field
of Harvard were reporters on that. And Charlie Wright was elected to the council following that reportership, in which he was a ardent participant in the affairs of the council and very devoted member. And his contribution was such that when it came to selecting a successor, his name loomed larger and larger, and ultimately he was the choice. It's interesting to note, we were talking about the increased opposition and how the ways of the Institute have changed over time from an original, very rigid set of rules to be followed. Things have become broadened and practice has become more flexible, and an illustration is for example, the degree to which members participate in the work of the Institute. At the time Jeff Hazard became director, I think I suggested that there ought to be, we discussed that there ought to be committees on program, Institute program, and Institute procedures. And then I had for some time harbored the notion that it'd be interesting to have members of the Institute invited to review a draft prior to its going to the advisors, the notion being that why wait until the annual meeting to have the input of interested members, at which point drafts are pretty well formulated. Why not have their input at an earlier stage so that the advisors and reporters will have the benefit of it when the advisors meet, and then council will have the benefit of the advisors and the members, and so on down to the annual meeting. And there was a special committee appointed, and on both the idea of program and on procedure, and this members consultative group idea was adopted. That member participation was given the name of members consultative group.
Yeah, there was a committee, I guess, on member participation.
Yeah, I think Gerhard.
No, that was the committee on procedures. Gerhard Casper was the
yeah,
chair
and he was chair of one of those. And out of that, I think that members consultative group has really increased the interest and participation of members in the affairs of in the projects of the Institute.
And I think that, as I recall, when Rod Perkins became president, he indicated that that was one of his great priorities, to find ways of getting members more involved than simply at the annual meeting stage. At least the members wanted
That's
to.
true. member participation rule used to be that a member was required to attend, if he didn't attend 3 meetings, he could be dropped from membership.
One every 3 years.
One every 3, something like that.
Yeah.
And the rule was never really enforced. But the rule was broadened to say that participation could take several forms. Attendance at in addition to attendance at meeting, members' consultative groups, and participation in ALIABA affairs. And I might add that some members of the Institute have made great contributions to work of ALIABA, and that they, to this day, have been very active in programs and publications of ALIABA. Can we have a recess?
Okay. Well, we're going to continue the discussion now, and I think that a question that probably a lot of people have about the Institute and the way it gets things done is the decision-making process in terms of the relationship between a president, a director, and in your case, an executive vice president. Did that ever cause any problems or difficulties or uncertainties as to where the lines were, or was that easy to draw?
Oh, there were no lines. It's a question of talking, communicating. If I had some thoughts, I would tell the director or the president, and the president had ideas, he'd tell the director and me, and if there was any difference, we'd discuss it. Ideas would be advanced, they might be rejected. Very seldom that happened, and it was a cooperative enterprise without any friction or problems in that respect. Everything, I think, worked remarkably well. The other aspect of it, not directly related to that question, was the notion of having the Institute and ALIABA together. As you may recall, it started off originally with ALIABA being under John Mulder and Institute under Goodrich, and ultimately, when I became involved in ALIABA, and particularly in 1963, when I became the director of ALIABA, I was sort of sitting on several chairs. And the thing worked remarkably well, I think, because of the lawyers that we had in the office working. Everybody viewed the enterprise as being well integrated, whether it was Walt McLaughlin, who was in charge of administrative services and fiscal affairs, or Don McClay, who was in ALIABA, or yourself when you were working primarily in ALI, Mark Carroll, Sharon, Larry Meehan.
Meyer Kramer?
Meyer Kramer at one time was in charge of both publications and periodicals. Mort Freeman. Nobody felt that they were confined to their activity if they were called upon to do something in another sphere of either operation. And particularly in the area of common services that like printing and accounting and personnel, never any problems. There were no question of priorities. Everything was discussed, and we did the best we could, and it worked out. And I think the people that were involved in the work of ALIABA and of ALI really made the enterprise a harmonious one, and working as a team without any thought of there being two different entities here. Same thing applied to our headquarters. We started off at 33rd and 36th and Walnut. When it came time to leave there, I went over to, I think, 133 South 33rd Street, and we had a very nice offices there, and then when we moved to 4025 Chestnut Street, we all worked to make this a pleasant environment, good place to work. And we started, I think, on one floor here, and now we have 3 floors. That connection, we had the ongoing negotiations for many years with the university about going back to the 40s. When law school was doing some renovating, there was talk of our moving into the law school and negotiations, but that never came about. And all the time, that kind of talk continued. What can we do to have a closer identity with the law school? Bernie Siegel, who was treasurer at the Institute and later, I think, vice president, also a trustee at the University of Pennsylvania, kept those discussions going. I remember several meetings with the president of the university about doing something to have a permanent home for the Institute in the university. There was even an executive committee when the law school was going to put on the addition. There were several things discussed. One was that they would have a research center on Sampson Street across from the law school. We would move in there. Another was that it would be on the other side of the street. And these were the continuing discussions about locating the Institute and the law school. Well, ultimately, we moved to this building, and when we moved to this building was owned by a private entrepreneur, and the tenants were the university and we. And by continuing our discussions about a closer liaison, ultimately this building was purchased by the university and the Institute as a joint enterprise. And then Bernie Siegel played a significant role in that, working with the university. And then ultimately we decided split ownership was not the best of worlds. We would have one ownership, and got involved in negotiating that. And now the Institute owns this building, which brings me back to the role of the treasurers in the Institute. The first treasurer I recall was a Washington tax lawyer by the name of Larry Williams, who was very active in our tax projects, and he was an advisor on and prime mover in those projects. And Larry was a superb treasurer, and but not in detail. Bernie Siegel succeeded him as treasurer, and Bernie and I worked harmoniously. We did most of the work here and sent it to Bernie for his final approval. I remember check signing became a burden. In those days, the treasurer signed the checks, and as our activities increased, the number of checks grew exponentially. And ultimately, it was agreed that I would do the check signing under appropriate resolution of limiting a certain amount. And that worked pretty well. But Bernie went over the budgets and the like when it came to presenting the budgets to the executive committee. And Walt McLaughlin and I would prepare them, and Bernie would approve them. Then Bennett Bosque became treasurer, and Bennett was as a treasurer, was much of an activist. He, I think, has a secret desire to run the Institute personally and to be involved in every facet of its operation, which showed great interest in the Institute and willingness to devote much of his time to our endeavors. And he took a personal interest in almost everything that involved the expenditure of money, and even in what our projects would be and what we would do, and I think he still does that.
He's also very involved in reading every word of every draft.
Well, I remember how he became involved in the council. He was an elected member, and at the annual meeting, on every draft, Bosque of the District of Columbia would have a contribution to make. And this happened project by project, year by year. And at one point, when it came time to have a to elect a member of the council. I think it was I, with the support of Herb Wexler, said, well, there's one man who really participates in the work of the Institute, and he should be on the council. And that's Bennett Bosque. And everyone agreed, and Bennett was elected to member of the council. And later on, when Bernie Siegel stepped down as treasurer, stepped up to the vice presidency, the question was who should be treasurer. And again, I urged, with the strong support of Herb Wexler, that Bennett Bosque should be treasurer. And Bennett was treasurer.
I think one possible correction we might want to make is that I think Lawrence Williams came after Bernie Siegel as treasurer, and
Well,
I think died in office, I think, didn't he, in 74, 75, and then
Who?
Bosque.
Larry Williams? Yeah, well, that may be right. Maybe it was reversed.
Yes.
Maybe, I have to check that.
So.
Maybe Bernie Siegel was treasurer, and when he became vice president,
Right.
Larry Williams became treasurer. I thought it was the other way around, but you may be quite right on that.
I think that may be the case, but we'll have to check to make sure. On the subject of administration and the functioning of the joint enterprise, it clearly having the Aliaba sharing the same space and working together in the same building has made a tremendous difference for the efficiency of the operations of the Institute, isn't that right?
Well, not only made a difference for the efficiency of the operation of the Institute, but I think for a very good part of the time, it made it possible, because the Institute could not afford, in many ways, to have the facilities that were required for the kind of operation of printing, distribution, office space, if it were involved alone, because in those days, while we allocated time, in other words, if you worked for the Institute, and Aliaba, you would allocate your time, and would be compensated from both sources. But for a while there, the people that did direct work for the Institute were just a handful, as compared to the people that were involved with the work of Aliaba. So that is true, that the sharing of physical space, the sharing of equipment, the sharing of personnel to operate the equipment, made available to the Institute techniques and processes that it could not otherwise afford. Things have changed financially for the Institute. The Institute's revenues are from dues, which go to support overhead, and grants, which support projects. And then there is revenue from its publications, ALI publishers. And that revenue for many years would fluctuate depending on when a new restatement came out, or a new edition of a restatement. Then there would be a distribution to what they call, Goodrich used to call the SOB list, which was the standing order of business list that West maintained. When a new book came out, it would be mailed to everybody on that list, and there would be revenue from that, and there would be sales. But that blew hot and cold depending on the progress of the work. And then an idea occurred that was accepted. I thought that we had the restatement in the courts, which came out periodically in a volume. One of the first things I did in the Institute, I think I mentioned earlier when I came here, was to hire young people to make those digests.
Right.
Well, the thought occurred that publishers were making money and driving revenue from regular supplementations. And why couldn't we do this by having the restatement in the courts come out as pocket parts? And that, of course, was adopted, and that resulted in a more even flow of income, an additional flow of income, because the restatement of course, what's it published now? Once or twice a year. supplements, the
Yes.
pocket parts, and then every once in a while the citations on the subject are gathered up and published as a separate volume.
Right.
And the restatement of the courts through this mechanism has really been a source of important revenue for the Institute.
You rather modestly said the thought occurred. The thought occurred to you, I believe. This was
I think that may be right.
And also, it occurs to me that I'm sure rightly spoke about how important all the various lawyers in various departments were to the smooth functioning of the organization. Clearly, you were the one who administered the whole thing and were able to see the entire picture and to keep it running so smoothly. How are you able to do that?
Well, I think God was good in the sense that he sent good people my way. Really, I meant it when I said that the contribution of the staff was unbelievable. And I mean, look at the quality of the staff we have. You are a PhD, you're a graduate of Harvard. We have lawyers that have worked for large, like Mark Carroll and Leslie Belasco. There may be others who work for large law firms, and gave up rather substantial income to come work for the modest sums we were able to pay, at least when they started. And I think that, luck was with me and the people that I was able to hire to work for the Institute. And I might add that nobody interfered with that. I was the one that interviewed people and hired them, and I was just lucky that they were top quality people.
Well, you know, Branch Rickey said that luck is the residue of design, and I suspect there was a good deal of design on your part as well as luck. In doing the research, by the way, for this interview, I came across some minutes from back around 1949 or 1950 of the Executive Committee, indicating that Judge Goodrich at that time had received a proposal from the Ballard Law Firm in Philadelphia to make space for Aliaba and have it a separate office in the Ballard firm's office. And the Executive Committee turned down that request, saying that the two organizations ought to remain together. And it's fascinating to think how your career might have been different and how the Aliaba and the Institute might have been different if that had been accepted.
I think as an aside, you ought to dig out those minutes and send it to this special merger committee that's meeting now. As a historical...
What goes around comes around.
Yeah, what goes around comes around. Again, you know, talking about the good fortune of people that we can get, and an illustration is the person who's recording this interview, somebody named Matt April. I mean, how do you find somebody like him? You can advertise or do whatever you want, but unless you have the good fortune of having someone like that come and say they want to work here, you will have problems.
Well, you did have a lot of good fortune then, I guess.
Well, I think in that sense, yes. We were talking about the money flow of the Institute before. I recall that, I don't know if I mentioned, I started to work for the Institute for I think the magnificent sum of $2,600. And getting increases in those days was a Herculean task that frequently failed. I remember Goodrich, I think, was making, and he gave it a lot of time, $5,000. And it was suggested that his salary was not adequate. And it was difficult to get the then president to agree to increases. And the one who carried the ball on increasing Goodrich's salary, I think by a magnificent sum of $2,500, was William Schneider, who was on the executive committee. And it took some engineering. I don't know whether Harrison Tweed was out that day of the meeting or not, but Bill Schneider got the increase approved.
So Tweed was a bit parsimonious.
Well, everybody was in those days.
Yeah.
It was unbelievable. I think if they saw what we're institute spending now, they would really be dumbfounded.
Well, I guess money went further in those days too, though, didn't it? So.
Not far enough.
Not far enough.
Not the money that the institute was paying anyway.
Well, we're coming, I think, to the end, for the time being at least, of this interview. And I have always found that when I read interviews, I always think that if I were doing the interviewing, I would have asked this or I would have asked that. Why didn't that person ask the question? But I've asked a lot of questions. I know you've had experience doing this too. One of your accomplishments was to start this whole tradition of oral history. So as an experienced question asker, I have to ask you, what would you ask yourself that I haven't asked you yet that you think ought to be brought
Well,
up?
I'd have to review the proceedings to know. I'd have to think about this. Nothing occurs to me offhand. We have had one advantage over the previous ones that were done. They were sort of done on a spot chance basis. I think Jim Kasner's was done at the Mayflower during the annual meeting, and Homer Kripke's was done at a UCC course Ali Abba was running, and Herb Wexler's was done at his apartment, and we spent a day. But in none of those instances did I have the advantage that you have of bringing the subject back for further grilling.
Which we may want to do. But let me just conclude with a question that you asked Herb Wexler, which seems like such a good question that I can't resist asking it to you. You said to Herb, what, if anything, would you do to revise the way the Institute operates, the way its membership is selected, the way the council is elected, and the way leadership is provided? Are there any changes that you think are indicated, or would you let well enough alone and think that things are working pretty well and may continue in the same way? That's a very broad question.
What was his answer before I answered?
Well, he said that, let me say that I think that if I were still involved with policy making on those points, I probably would have not favored the principal change that was made in Institute procedures, namely opening the matter up to further preliminary discussion among volunteer groups of members. And that's something, of course, that...
well, that's where Herb and I differed. I was waiting for a new director to spring that plan again. Oh, I think there ought to be greater communication between the executive committee and the council, between the council and the members. We had a meeting recently, a telephone conference call of the bylaws committee. I would be all in favor of having the minutes of the executive committee meeting and the council meetings either summarized or distributed to the members. So the members have a fuller sense of what's involved in the work of the Institute. Right now, I think the conception is that drafts are published. This is it, and we have a chance to discuss it in a members' advisory group or at the annual meeting. They don't know, they don't fully appreciate the labor and thought that goes into producing that kind of draft. And if they saw the minutes of discussions at council meeting, or if they were aware of the problems of administration that the executive committee considers, if they knew more about the budgeting process, I think it would make for a greater involvement on their part and have a membership that would be going to do more to advance the objectives of the Institute, both financially and substantively on their projects. Many years ago, when I first started, there was even less information exchange between the members, the council, and the executive committee than there is today. And I think there's much to be gained by having fuller disclosure and distribution of information, and that this would make for a stronger membership generally.
in that context, of course, we've overlooked another one of your innovations, the ALI Reporter, which is a newsletter, does communicate to the membership various things that go on in the Institute. Perhaps that could be a means of conveying more of that kind of information than it...
Well, yeah, except that I think the reporters made a great impression on the membership. They know things that are happening currently. But I think it still doesn't give the full picture. If you read the minutes of a council meeting and see what goes into the discussion, I don't think members have any idea of the amount of effort, thought, and work involved in individual council members in the process of approving drafts.
Right.
I think it's something to be thought about. It involves much more work and perhaps more money, but we can afford that now. We can even afford more people to help you do this.
That would be welcome.
All right, so moved.
Okay. Well, you mentioned the council, and of course you are now a member of the council, but you have indicated that you don't want to talk about that yet because that's not history, that's the future. So I hope that we will be able to get together sometime at a later date after you've had some history on the council and be able to reminisce about that as well.
I think what we ought to do on these audiovisual histories is have annual pocket parts.
Well, that sounds like a good idea.
If the subjects survive.
Well, I'm confident that it will, and again, I think that's another great idea.
I might mention I was up last week at the memorial service for Haskell Cohn, who did so much for Ali Abba. And it was interesting how many members of the Institute and the council showed up at that. I guess one reason is that so many of them live up in Boston and its environs. But there was one of the speakers was Dean Griswold, and Justice Wilkins was there, and others. And I think it shows the regard and quote love quote that Institute members have for each other, particularly at the level of the council.
Well, that's a great note to end for the time being, and we hope we will be able to continue it later on, and you can tell us more about your views of the council when you've had more experience as a member.
Very good. Thank you, Mike. You were good.
Well, thanks very much for doing it.